Amma had always dreamed of her wedding day, and now it was finally here. The streets of Kumasi were alive with music, drumming, and chatter, the kind of festive noise that always surrounded big family events. Her gown shimmered in the afternoon sun, and her smile lit up the room as friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate. On the surface, everything looked perfect, but behind the laughter and the dancing, Amma could feel something was wrong. Her heart raced with excitement, yet she couldn't ignore the cold glances from her new in-laws. While others embraced her warmly, they stood stiff and distant, as though she were a stranger who had wandered into their home uninvited. She greeted them with the respect she had been taught, but their replies were clipped, their smiles forced. It was her wedding day, yet she felt more like an intruder than a bride. Amma tried to brush it off, convincing herself it was nerves or stress, but whispers floated through the crowd, words carried just low enough to sting. She caught fragments, comments about her family background, her worthiness, her place in this new household. Each murmur cut deeper, threatening to ruin the joy she had built up in her heart. As the drummers played louder and the dancers filled the yard, Amma held her head high, pretending not to notice. Still, a quiet sadness settled over her spirit. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but already, it didn't feel like hers at all. The reception was in full swing. Drummers beat their talking drums, guests clapped and cheered, and women in bright Kent wrappers moved gracefully across the floor. Plates of jollof rice and fried chicken made their rounds, and the air was filled with laughter and joy. Amma sat by her husband, Kwame, her heart still heavy, but trying to blend into the celebration. She told herself to focus on the good, the music, the dancing, the smiles of her childhood friends who had come to support her. For a moment, she almost believed she could push aside the strange chill from her in-laws and just enjoy the evening. Then it happened. A guest's drink slipped from his hand, spilling red sabalo across the tiled floor. Before Amma could even process it, her mother-in-law, Yasurwa, turned sharply toward her. With a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she barked, "Amma, get up and clean this mess." The words cut through the music like a blade. The room seemed to pause for a second, eyes darting to the bride. Some guests chuckled nervously, others looked away, pretending not to notice. Amma froze. Her cheeks burned hot, and her hands trembled. She wanted to believe she had misheard, but Yasurwa's eyes were cold and commanding, leaving no doubt. Slowly, Amma rose, her wedding gown dragging across the floor as she bent to find a rag. Her heart pounded. She could feel every gaze on her, weighing her down. Laughter erupted in one corner of the room. A cousin of Kwame leaned toward another and whispered, loud enough for Amma to hear, "Look at the new bride, already the house help." Another added, "At least she's useful for something." The words stung like fire, but Amma forced her face into calmness. She bent down, her veil brushing the sticky floor as she wiped the drink. Each stroke of her hand against the tiles was a strike against her dignity, but she remained silent. Inside, her chest tightened with shame, yet she refused to let her tears fall where they could be seen. She bit her lip until it hurt, holding them back. The hall buzzed again with laughter and conversation, but Amma knew the moment had already been stamped in everyone's memory. The bride made to clean on her wedding day. Kwame said nothing. He watched but didn't move, and that silence hurt more than the insults. Amma wanted him to reach for her hand, to shield her from the cruelty, but he just sat there, still as a statue. When Amma finally straightened, rag in hand, she forced a small smile, though her heart was breaking. She told herself she would endure it, that maybe this was just the beginning and things might get better. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this was not the end, it was only the first wound of many. The music and laughter from the reception still floated through the air, but Amma was far from the dance floor. She stood in the kitchen, sleeves of her white gown pulled awkwardly up, hands deep in soapy water. Plates stacked higher than her arms lined the counter, and the sink was overflowing with dirty glasses. Her veil had slipped to one side, and the hem of her dress was stained with food and water. It was supposed to be the dress of her dreams, but here she was, scrubbing like a servant on the very night she became a bride. It hadn't been her choice. One of Kwame's aunties had marched into the room earlier, carrying a tray of dirty plates. She placed it in front of Amma and said, half smiling, half mocking, "A wife must know her place. Start here." Before Amma could protest, more trays followed, each piled with dishes from the tables outside. Soon, the kitchen looked like a small battlefield of cups, bowls, and greasy spoons. Amma's hands moved mechanically, her mind spinning. Every scrape of sponge against plate felt like a slap against her pride. She wanted to scream, to ask why she was being treated this way, but her voice refused to come out. She remembered her late father's advice. Patience brings peace. And so she bit her tongue and kept scrubbing. Then the voices came. Two of her in-laws leaned against the doorway, arms folded, eyes fixed on her. One whispered with a smirk, "See? She fits the part." A servant, not a wife. Another laughed, replying, Kwame chose well. At least she'll keep the house clean. Their laughter spread like fire, and soon a few more relatives joined in, peeking into the kitchen as though watching a show. Alma's eyes blurred with tears, but she blinked them back. She didn't want them to have the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her fingers, wrinkled from the water, tightened around a glass. She thought about how she had imagined this day, how she had dreamed of dancing freely, of sitting proudly beside her husband, of being welcomed with love into her new family. Instead, here she was mocked and humiliated, her dignity stripped away. The noise from the hall grew louder, songs of joy and celebration clashing against the heaviness in her chest. Alma felt like she was living in two worlds at once, one where people celebrated her as a bride, and another where she was reduced to a maid. Still, she kept washing, not because she wanted to, but because her pride told her not to give them the chance to call her lazy. Each plate she scrubbed was a quiet rebellion, proof that even humiliated, she could endure. But in her heart, the pain was sharp. This was not how a bride should feel on her wedding night. And though she swallowed her pride to survive the moment, she knew the wound it left would not heal quickly. Alma's hands were still damp from the sink when she walked back into the hall. She had forced herself to put on a small smile, but her eyes betrayed her. She searched for comfort, for a hand to hold, for the one person who was supposed to be her shield. Her gaze fell on Kwame. He was sitting quietly at the high table, his eyes following her, but his lips never opened. She had expected him to rise, to defend her when his mother ordered her to clean the floor, when his aunties pushed dirty dishes into her arms, when the mocking laughter rang across the kitchen. But Kwame had stayed seated, hands folded, eyes lowered, as if the whole thing had nothing to do with him. To everyone else, it looked like he was simply being respectful, allowing his elders to take charge. To Alma, it felt like betrayal. This was the man who had whispered love into her ears under the mango tree. The man who had promised, "With me, you will never walk alone." Yet here she was, walking alone through humiliation, with the whole hall as witness. He did not reach for her hand. He did not say a word. His silence screamed louder than all the insults she had endured. Alma sat beside him, her gown heavy on her lap, and glanced at him with pleading eyes. Just one word of comfort, she thought. Just one sign that he was on her side. But Kwame kept his eyes fixed on his plate, poking at his food like a boy afraid of his mother's scolding. He laughed faintly at a joke one of his cousins made, pretending nothing was wrong, as if Alma's humiliation was invisible. In that moment, a deep realization sank into her chest. She had not just married Kwame. She had married his family, their opinions, their authority, their cruelty. Kwame was not standing apart from them. He was tied to them, bound by loyalty stronger than his love for her. His silence was his answer, and it broke her heart more than his mother's words ever could. Alma felt a loneliness she had never known before. Surrounded by hundreds of people, she was still utterly alone. The man who should have been her voice had chosen to mute himself. The man who should have been her strength had chosen to shrink. And as the drums beat louder, as the singers raised their voices in celebration, Alma's spirit grew quieter. She looked down at her stained dress, then at her husband, and a truth struck her with painful clarity. Love without courage was not enough. Kwame's silence was not just fear. It was agreement. It was surrender. It was a message that his mother's approval mattered more than her dignity. And Alma, sitting beside him, felt her heart breaking in a way that no music, no feast, no laughter could ever cover. The kitchen was quieter now, though the sound of music and dancing still drifted in from the hall. Alma stood over the sink, her hands raw from scrubbing, her dress clinging to her like a burden. She thought maybe the worst was over. Maybe they would let her slip back to her seat and pretend none of it had happened. But then she heard them. Two of her in-laws stood just outside the door, their voices sharp and careless, unaware that every word reached Alma's ears. "Did you see how easily she bent?" one said with a laugh. "This is what happens when you marry from a poor home. They have no pride." Another voice joined in. "Kwame could have done better, but at least she will obey." Their laughter echoed like knives against the walls, cutting deeper than anything Alma had faced that day. Her hands froze in the soapy water. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Poor background. No pride. Not worthy. The words pressed against her chest, heavy and cruel. She felt her eyes sting again, but this time something different rose inside her. It wasn't just sadness. It was fire. Her father's voice came to her, as clear as if he were standing beside her. "Respect is not given," he used to say. "You command it." She remembered the way he had lived, working hard with dignity, never letting anyone trample his spirit, even when life gave him little. He had raised her to walk with her head high, and here she was, bowing her head before people who mocked her. Alma let out a long, shaky breath. Slowly, she pulled her veil off her head and set it on the counter. The veil was supposed to be a symbol of her new beginning, but now it felt like chains holding her down. Without it, she felt lighter, freer. She wiped her wet cheeks with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders. No more hiding. No more silence. She could endure insults, but she would not let them strip her of her worth. If they wanted to see her as a servant, then they would have to face her voice too. She picked up the veil once more, stared at it for a moment, then left it behind on the counter like a burden she was done carrying. With slow, steady steps, Amma walked out of the kitchen. The noise from the reception grew louder as she moved toward the hall. Every step felt like a decision, every breath like a declaration. She was no longer just the bride they mocked. She was her father's daughter, a woman who would no longer bow. The whispers grew as she appeared in the doorway, gown damp, face bare, eyes burning with quiet strength. Amma was ready. If they wanted a show, she would give them one, but it would not be the show they expected. The hall was still alive with noise when Amma stepped out of the kitchen. Her gown was damp, her hands were raw, and her veil was gone, but her eyes carried a fire that silenced her fear. Guests turned one by one, their laughter fading as they noticed her standing in the doorway. The drummers slowed, the singers' voices wavered. Something about the way she held herself demanded attention. Amma walked to the center of the room, every step echoing louder than the music. She stood tall, her chest rising and falling as she gathered her breath. For a moment, she simply looked around, at her husband sitting frozen, at her mother-in-law watching with narrowed eyes, at the cousins and aunties who had laughed at her pain. She let the silence grow heavy, and then her voice broke through. "You dressed me in white," she said, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "You placed a crown on my head and called me a bride. But today, you have treated me like a servant." Gasps rippled across the room, but Amma pressed on. Her words carried the weight of every tear she had swallowed. She turned toward Yasurwa, her mother-in-law. "If you wanted a maid, you shouldn't have dressed me as a bride. If you wanted someone to scrub your floors and wash your dishes, you should have been honest. Do not call me a wife if all you see in me is a servant." The hall grew still. Some guests looked down, ashamed. Others stared wide-eyed, unsure if they should speak. Amma's voice rose stronger, shaking with both pain and power. "I came into this family with love and respect. I greeted you with open hands, and in return you gave me humiliation. You mocked my background, you laughed at my tears. But I will not bow my head to cruelty. I am more than the insults you throw at me." Her words cut through the air like thunder. People shifted in their seats, whispering nervously. A few women in the back nodded, their eyes glistening. Amma lifted her chin higher. "Respect is not given. You command it. Today I command mine." For a long moment, silence filled the hall. The music had stopped, the laughter gone. All that remained was Amma's voice ringing in the hearts of everyone who... Then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was one of the elders seated near the front. Soon another joined, and another. The clapping spread, soft at first, then louder, until the hall was filled with applause. Amma stood in the middle of it all, her gown stained but her spirit shining. She was no longer the quiet bride hiding her pain. She had spoken her truth, and the room had listened. And though her in-laws sat stiff with embarrassment, Amma knew she had reclaimed something greater than acceptance. She had reclaimed her dignity. Kwame felt the heat of 100 eyes burning into him as Amma's words echoed through the hall. He sat stiffly in his chair, sweat gathering at his temples, his hands fidgeting nervously. This was not how he imagined his wedding reception would unfold. Instead of being celebrated as the proud groom, he was being exposed as the man who had stayed silent while his wife was shamed. Every clap from the guests struck him like a slap. Elders nodded at Amma with respect, while women whispered to each other, shaking their heads at him. Some even pointed, murmuring, "How could a man sit there and let his wife be treated that way?" Kwame lowered his gaze, wishing the floor would swallow him whole. His chest tightened with a mix of anger and humiliation, not at his family, but at Amma for daring to challenge them so openly. He leaned toward her, his voice sharp but low. "Amma, enough. Sit down. You're embarrassing us." He reached for her arm, hoping to pull her back into her seat, to end the spectacle before it ruined his image completely. But Amma pulled her arm free and lifted her voice even louder. "I am not embarrassing you, Kwame. You embarrassed yourself when you chose silence over love. You embarrassed yourself when you let me scrub floors in my wedding dress while you sat and watched." Her words hit harder than any hand ever could. The hall stirred again, and this time the clapping grew louder, mixed with voices of agreement. Kwame's face burned. He wanted to silence her, to shout her down, but he couldn't. The guests were no longer on his side. Even some of his own friends avoided his eyes, ashamed for him. In that moment, the power he thought he held slipped from his grasp. Amma, the woman he assumed would bend to his family's will, now stood taller than him, her voice commanding the entire room. Amma turned her gaze back to the crowd, her chin lifted high. A husband is meant to protect, not to hide. A wife is not a slave, not a toy, not a burden. If love means silence in the face of cruelty, then it is not love at all. The applause that followed was thunderous, rolling through the hall like a storm. Women clapped with tears in their eyes, men nodded solemnly, and even the drummers struck their drums again, as if to honor her. Kwame sat frozen, his hands clenched on his knees. His authority as groom, as husband, as son, all seemed to shrink in the shadow of Amma's strength. She had turned the moment of her greatest humiliation into her greatest triumph. For the first time that night, Amma was no longer the victim. She was the voice, the leader, the woman who stood unbroken. And as the hall erupted in support, Kwame realized with dread that this wedding no longer belonged to him or his family. It belonged to Amma. The clapping would not stop. What began as a few hands had grown into a roar of applause, echoing through the decorated hall. Amma stood in the center, her chest rising and falling, her stained gown glowing under the lights. For once, all eyes were not mocking her, they were honoring her. One of the elders, a respected man with gray hair and a heavy voice, rose slowly from his chair. He tapped his walking stick against the floor until the room quieted. "This girl has spoken truth," he said firmly, his eyes sweeping across the hall. "Marriage is not a cage. It is a union, and no bride should be made to wash dishes on the day she is supposed to be celebrated. Shame on those who allowed this." His words landed heavily, and many nodded in agreement. Another elder, an old woman in a colorful Kent shawl, stood as well. Her voice cracked with age, but her words carried strength. "I was once like her," she confessed. "On my wedding day, I too was mocked by my in-laws. I swallowed my pain and said nothing. I lived with that silence for years. Today I see her courage, and I say, well done, my daughter. Speak, because silence only feeds cruelty." Murmurs of support spread across the room. Women from different corners of the hall began speaking up, some with trembling voices, others bold. One said, "We know this pain. Too many of us were treated like servants in the homes we married into. But we never had the chance to fight back." Another added, "Amma has given voice to all of us who were silenced." Amma's heart swelled as she listened. The same guests who had whispered against her earlier were now clapping, nodding, and even wiping tears from their eyes. The tide had turned. The hall that once mocked her had become her choir of support. Surwa sat stiff in her chair, her face dark with anger, but even she could feel the shift. The room no longer bowed to her authority. Every word of praise for Amma was a direct strike against her cruelty. Kwame, still seated beside his mother, lowered his head further, trapped in shame as the crowd sided with his wife. The drummers, sensing the energy, struck their drums again, this time not for celebration of a union, but in honor of Amma's defiance. The beats echoed her strength, filling the hall with a rhythm that felt like triumph. Guests began to chant her name softly at first, then louder. Amma, Amma, Amma. What started as humiliation had transformed into victory. She was no longer just the bride in a white gown. She had become a symbol of resistance, of courage, of dignity reclaimed. Amma stood there, tears glistening on her cheeks, but these were no longer tears of pain. They were tears of relief, of power, of knowing that her voice had broken chains, not only for herself but for many women watching who had once been silent. The hall was still buzzing with noise when Amma took a final look around. Her veil was gone, her dress was stained, and her hands were tired, but her spirit stood taller than ever before. She had spoken her truth, and the people had heard her. No drumbeat, no song, no mockery could erase the words she had thrown into the air. They hung there, sharp and unforgettable. Amma turned her eyes to Kwame. He sat slumped, his face heavy with shame, unable to meet her gaze. The man who had promised her love had failed her in her first hour as his wife. She felt no anger now, only clarity. She realized she could not build her future on silence, and she could not lean on a man who hid behind his mother's shadow. With slow, steady steps, Amma began to walk toward the exit. Guests parted to make way for her, some reaching out to touch her shoulder in quiet support. A few elders bowed their heads as she passed, their eyes filled with respect. The chants of her name softened into murmurs of blessing. Each step she took was a step away from humiliation, a step into something new. She did not cry. She did not stumble. Her head was high, her back straight, her gown trailing like a banner of victory behind her. People had tried to make her small, but she left larger than life. Outside, the night air wrapped around her like freedom. The stars above Kumasi glittered, and for the first time that day, she breathed deeply, letting the cool breeze wash away the sting of the insults. She whispered to herself, "I will not bow. I will rise." It was not just a promise, it was a vow to herself. In that moment, she decided her future would not be tied to Kwame's silence or his family's cruelty. She would build her own path, with or without him. She would work, she would grow, and she would stand on her own 2 feet. Her worth would not be measured by her husband's approval or her in-laws' opinions, but by her strength and determination. Back inside the hall, her in-laws sat stiff and uneasy. Surwa's pride had been wounded. her control shattered in front of the entire community. She had thought Amma would bend, that her insults would break the girl from the poor home. But now she saw too late. Amma was not weak. She was steel wrapped in silk, a woman who could not be crushed. The whispers in the hall had already begun. People would talk of this night for years to come. Not about the food, not about the music, not even about the groom. They would speak of Amma, the bride who refused to bow. And as she walked into the night, leaving behind the noise of the hall, Amma knew this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new one, written not with tears, but with fire. Amma's story did not end in that hall. In the days and weeks that followed, her name spread across Kumasi. People spoke not of a broken bride, but of a woman who stood up for herself when it mattered most. The image of her, standing in her stained wedding gown with fire in her eyes, became a memory no one could forget. Women whispered her name in marketplaces, in salons, in quiet corners of their homes. Many said, "She spoke for us all." Some remembered their own wedding days, when they had been mocked, silenced, or treated as less than wives. They had endured in silence. But Amma's courage gave them a voice. She had shown them that dignity was not something handed to you, it was something you claimed. Even the men of the community could not deny her strength. Elders spoke of her as an example, telling their sons, "A wife is not a servant. She is your partner." The story became a warning to those who thought cruelty was tradition, and a lesson that respect must sit at the center of marriage. Amma herself did not seek fame. She carried on quietly, building her life with determination. But wherever she went, people looked at her differently. Not as the girl from a poor home, not as the wife who was humiliated, but as the bride who refused to bow. And so her story became bigger than her pain. It became a light for others, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage can rise. They mocked her in a gown, but she rose like a queen. And in rising, she made every woman believe that they too could rise.